Party reserves. Pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from Delaware, Ms. Lisa Lunt Rochester. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Dr. Bright, so much for your testimony, but also for your courage here today. As you can hear from our colleagues, there is not a person in this room or in this country who hasn't been personally touched by COVID-19, and your statement that we need to be told the truth is probably the most important statement we've heard all day, because we know that if we don't face it, we can't fix it. So I want to personally thank you on behalf of all Americans for your courage to testify before us today. And I want to say that my focus for this hearing is really on 3 things. Number 1, what have we learned? Number 2, what do we need to do now? And number 3, what can we do to prevent or mitigate the risks of an additional wave of COVID-19? It's clear since January of this year that there has been a failure on the part of the administration to use the scientific evidence that's been presented by the nation's top public health officials to take comprehensive, and I'll use that word again, comprehensive, appropriate and urgent action to respond to COVID-19. One of the most pressing outstanding needs that has yet to be addressed is the need for a national testing strategy. Dr. Bright, in your testimony, you mentioned the need for such a strategy that ensures tests are, among other things, available to everyone who needs them. I, along with Congressman Colin Peterson and Representative Bela from Texas, wrote a letter to the Democratic and the Republican House leadership in the House and the Senate. And we really impressed upon them the need for outlining the importance of a robust testing plan for our testing and tracing. And while current testing capacity is 1.6 million diagnostic tests per week, healthcare experts say that we're woefully short of the estimated 30 million tests per week that we need to get America back to work as safely and confidently as possible, and to avert or mitigate a second wave of COVID-19, which is one of my biggest concerns. Dr. Bright, what are the immediate steps that HHS needs to be taking to ramp up testing capacity now through the fall, and what targets should they be held accountable for?
I think what's really interesting about the testing story that gets lost in the narrative sometimes is the confusion about the different types of tests. There's an antigen test that tells you if you have the virus in you. There's a PCR test that says that maybe there are fragments of the virus, and there's this antibody test that looks at your antibody titer to try to tell you you've been exposed already, maybe immune to the virus. There's a lot of confusion, and I think the first thing HHS needs to do is determine which of those tests is most important to achieve which objective. If the antigen test is what's needed because it's faster and lower cost and more readily available in some cases, what does it tell Americans? What does it tell employers? What does it tell schools about the potential for an individual who has a positive or negative on that test and their potential to have a different result the next day or later that day? There's a lot of confusion about these tests. So I think the first thing that HHS should do is determine the type of test and how that test would be used effectively. And then make sure that we have enough of those types of tests and they're in the right place, and the people using them know what the data tells them and how to use it effectively. I think there's a lot of confusion there, and they need leadership in HHS to distinguish those challenges and clarify that for the American public. It's not just a test. Many different tests, they tell you different things.
Thank you, thank you. And why do you think that our nation has struggled with ramping up the testing capacity, unlike other countries? And were there contingencies in place or a backup in light of this situation we're in now?
I think part of the struggle is waiting too late to think about it and to get it started. And when we've had conversations with some manufacturers, they've been very creative in how they can ramp up. Another part of the challenge is we've allowed many of these capabilities to be offshored. And so we have much more capability of expanding domestic capacity when it's in our country, and we can ramp up and bring innovation to those companies in the US. But if the supply chain is offshore and there's a global need and competition for that supply chain, that also significantly impairs our ability to ramp up.
Again, I just want to thank you so much for the time that you have contributed to our country, but also for your courage to be here right now. Many of us are challenged as Democrats and Republicans to make sure that our country is safe and healthy, and it really is, I don't think I've ever in my lifetime seen anything like this, and it does require us to look back and at the same time look forward and make sure that we have what we need as a country. So I thank you again, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Does the minority reserve? All right. Then it's a pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for his 5 minutes of questions.